Chapter 1. The Door with No Memory. The hangar was not so much abandoned as it was forgotten by the people who had forgotten the town, which was a small arrangement of wind-bent roofs and rust-bitten towers clinging to the desert margins of a failing starport, where the landing grids glowed only when someone remembered to take pity on them. And most of the time no one did. Not anymore. Not since the freight lines were rerouted to grander hubs, and the pilgrim caravans learned to fly over the dust rather than through it. All of that suited Aaron Kill as he walked across the brittle concrete, a folded bill of 60 local cents in his pocket, and a grin he couldn't keep from his face, because there is a specific thrill reserved for people who buy dead things on a hunch that they are only sleeping, a thrill that lives behind the ribs like a stowaway heartbeat and tells you that you have seen something everyone else missed, that you spotted a glimmer in the ashes and dared to reach into the cooling coals, and Aaron had lived on that feeling for years, repairing farm haulers for cash and barter, and quietly stealing time to scavenge in the decommissioned segments of the port, where rumor said the inspectors stopped inspecting and the alarms learned the mercy of silence. The hangar's frontage was a slab of corrugated alloy patched with ship-grade epoxy in squares the color of old bruises, and the door was a sinking rectangle that had fought every storm and won by refusing to open, and when he laid his hand on it, he felt the small harmonics that only older metals carry, as if the door still remembered the shapes of machines that once slid past it under their own power and left ghost pressures in the frame. He pressed his ear to the seam and heard nothing but wind, yet his palm tingled like a radio waking up, so he stepped back, tested the mechanical lock long since jammed with a bent bolt and a superstition, and slid the battered key the municipal clerk had sold him for 60 cents plus a wink, which had angered him until he realized that the wink was the clerk's apology for a world where a hangar could be worth less than a cup of boiled tea. When the key turned, the sound was not a click but a sigh, and the door rolled up in increments he had to coax with both hands on the handle, crouched backed into the wind, legs straining as if he were dragging an anchor out of a river of sand. Then, with a rattle like loose teeth in a tin, the door shuddered to its apex and stuck there, and the light lanced inward to reveal the bones of a room that had not been lit in a decade. Racks like empty cathedral pews, tool cradles without tools, a floor painted in old hazard chevrons that rose through the dust like the back of a sleeping animal, and at the far end, eclipsing the last 20 meters, a silhouette so deep it drank the light and returned nothing, a ship-shaped absence that made his lungs remember what air was for. He did not step forward immediately, because something in that shadow owned the pace of the moment, and it had the patience of bedrock. He waited in the door glare, eyes watering in the wind, remembering the exchange with the clerk who had shrugged and said that the hangar was classified as miscellaneous municipal assets, which was a department for brooms and broken stretchers and the sorts of things civic budgets try to forget. And Aaron had said, "I'll take it," and when the clerk asked why, he had replied with the closest thing to a true answer, "Because it calls to me from the map like a lighthouse I cannot see." And while the clerk had laughed, the records had yielded and the key had been surrendered, and now here he was, facing a shadow that had gravity. He went in slow, boot soles leaving crescent moons in the dust, and as his eyes adjusted he began to parse edges. A long forward spine like the keel of a submarine rotated 90 degrees, a pair of arcs that might have been wings but the spacing was wrong, too narrow to ride atmosphere and too broad to fit any class of starship he knew. Where other crafts sported landing struts like jointed birds, this one rested on a cradle of welded frames and old polymer blocks, as if someone had stripped away its feet to keep it from walking out, and the thought cracked across his mind with a strange flash of certainty, as if the ship were the kind of animal that would run if you looked away. Except it wasn't an animal. Except maybe it was in the way a city is an animal, old enough to have a temperament. And then he reached the placard bolted to the cradle and brushed it off and read a designation that meant nothing at first, SCP 2740/K Tarragon, and below that a set of maintenance stencils so out of date his mouth went dry, markings from the First Dissolution War, a conflict so ancient that even the Academy lectures about it felt like myths told by timid ghosts. And before he could question whether this was some local's idea of a joke, he saw the other symbol, stamped half under the cradle plate and half on the hull, a diamond and sunburst sigil that every pilot carried in their cortex like a prayer. The seal of the pre-collapse strategic relic program, the one that took machines too dangerous, too strange, too influential to destroy, and hid them where no one would find them, which was exactly the sort of organization that would choose a tired border port hangar to bury a problem, and the idea that such a program had left a relic in a place he could buy for 60 cents felt like a trick of fate too sharp to look at directly. So he didn't. He did what he always did when shock threatened to climb his throat. He reached for a tool. The power grid to the hangar was half dead, but not quite, and he coaxed a trickle through a converter he wore like a necklace on salvage runs, and the big arc lamps along the rafters flickered and steadied, and the ship's shadow resolved into a body that wasn't a ship, not in any catalog sense. A fuselage made of interlocking facets like beetle plates, skin that shimmered dully, as if remembering a color it refused to wear in public, a nose that widened toward the tip instead of narrowing, and, on either side of that flat-ended prow, arrays of sockets that would have been weapon ports if they weren't arranged like the teeth of a comb, too many and too fine, and his bones filed a complaint that his eyes refused to forward to his brain because there was something else now. A scent rising elusive under the copper and dust hangar musk, a hint of singed cinnamon, and he realized it was not incense but insulation, not burned but excited, a polymer that off-gasses faintly when it senses humidity changes, which ships do when they wake. He said hello out loud because he was the kind of man who poured words into the yawning jaws of silence to trick himself into believing he was not inside a leviathan's mouth. And somewhere within the hull something flexed as gently as a thought forming, and the floor under his boots ticked as if a hot engine had just been shut down, and he did not run because the fear of squandering a miracle is heavier than the fear of the miracle itself. And that is how chapter 1 of his life ended, with Aaron Kill standing in a hangar he owned for 60 cents, staring at a machine no pilot dared to touch, while that machine decided whether it would permit him to know its name. Chapter 2. The engine that ate the map. He had fixed many drives, from the cheap spin-grav wheels whose bearings wore down to ovals and screamed like kettles to the respectable Alcubierre collared rigs whose failure modes included snapping a ship's spine like a breadstick. And he had even once replaced a phase membrane in a tunneling skiff that had learned to fold only one wing at a time and kept falling sideways into its own shadow. None of that expertise helped him in the first hour of staring at the belly of the relic, because its underside had no panels or access lines or standardized ports, only a seam that ran the length of the body like the thin smile of a polite predator, and a pattern of hexagonal areoles that grew denser toward the seam until they became a continuous strip of matte darkness so light-absorbent he saw his reflection as a negative, pale features floating in a phantom where pupils should be. He did what salvage people do when nothing makes sense. He walked the perimeter with a light and a notebook and drew what he could not name, turning curves into angles and guesses into measurements so he could anchor his ignorance to paper. And in the doing he found the first explicit warning stenciled on the wall under the catwalk, flanked by faded hazard glyphs: do not energize. Do not energize. Do not energize repeated like a mantra in 6 languages, and then a 7th line in red pencil, newer than the rest, reading in an untidy hand. Unless you are very sure you are meant to. He stood there with the lamp throwing his elongated shadow across the hull, and he laughed once at the kind of engineer who writes a note to the future in the voice of a fairy tale, but the laugh did not survive his second reading of the line, because it felt like being addressed by someone who had survived a thing by the width of a hair and had put their shaking hands to work so the next person might survive by the width of 2. Energize, then, but how and with what, and to what end? Because Aaron could conjure power and mean little streams and coax a dying grid into one last candle flame. But whatever this was, it would not stir for candles, it would want a sunrise. He set up camp along the wall where an old office backed the hangar, filling a jug from the cracked sink that still leaked from a cistern that still remembered rain, unrolling a blanket in the corner under a window, slashed with sun. And he told himself he would sleep before he did anything as magnificently foolish as improvising an interface with a relic machine in a municipal property with no one to help him if it decided to eat him through a straw. He lay there watching dust float like seed fluff, but his mind did not sleep. It designed, it rearranged, it crawled along the chain link thinking of inductive couplers he could wind from scavenged copper, of battery stacks he could lash in series to produce a brief pulse, of the retired solar glaze on the roof that might still yield a blush at sundown, of the 2 hydrogen bottles in the corner he had seen under a tarp, probably left over from a ground vehicle that once visited on better days, and he rose before he realized he had risen, and began soldering with the care of a monk illuminating a forbidden page, using tools from his go bag and wire stripped from the dead lamps near the back wall. And as he worked, a strange relief came to him that he had not felt since boyhood, when he took apart his mother's busted blender and found the burrs clogged with sesame. A relief that felt like hearing a low hum that had been there all along and now suddenly matched the pitch of his ribcage. And in that harmony the work accelerated. Couplers took shape like nested bracelets. He bolted them to improvised arms he could swing under the belly seam. He wheeled the battery cart he kept for jump-starting tractors and lashed it to the couplers with braided cables like leashes for sleeping dragons. And when sunset painted the roof with a sideways blessing, he went up and wiped grit from the glass and reconnected the inverters. And the panels whispered old words to him in the meter's needle, barely any, but some, enough to paint the edges of what might be possible. Back on the floor, he tightened the final lug and put his palm to the seam and felt nothing except the heat of his own life reflected, and he laughed again, softer, because of course the first try would be a failure. Failure was the grammar of discovery. Failure was a sacrament. Failure taught the machine who you were by teaching you who you were not. And so he powered the array and watched the needles climb, and the cables twitch, and the couplers sing like metallic bees, and the seam remained seam-like. And he did not feel disappointment because this was the necessary sacrifice. And he shut it all down and stepped away and drank from the jug, and then a very small thing happened, which is how the largest things prefer to begin. One of the hexagonal areoles flickered as if a moth had flown behind frosted glass and cast a momentary silhouette. But there was no moth here, and there was no glass. Only a skin that had pretended to be inert until curiosity tightened its veil and gave him a single blink. "Hello," he said again, because it had worked for other creatures, and because he wanted to be the kind of person who spoke before he touched. And this time he felt a tiny pressure against his palm, like a heartbeat you can only feel when you press your finger to your eyelid. The pulse so delicate he almost dismissed it. And then it repeated with the calm of a machine that does not show off. And he tasted metal and cinnamon on the air again. And he realized what bothered him about the nose. It was flat-ended because it was not a nose but a door designed to present no purchase to grapples or rams, a door that would never open for force but might, perhaps, for a pattern. And in the old stories, patterns were always prayers coded as rhythm. He shut off the converter and the lamps and the couplers until the hangar was all shadow and night breath. And then he drummed his fingers softly on the seam in a cadence he had learned in dockside bars. The one that means, "Are you awake, friend? I brought something I cannot carry alone." And nothing happened because this was not a bar and the machine did not drink. So he changed the rhythm to the first beat pattern they teach you in NAV school: 1 2 3 pause 1 2 pause 1, and on the third loop the seam warmed under his skin, and what he had thought were hexagonal areoles lit from within like deep-sea creatures, amber pale and receding in waves. And the seam left its seamness and became a parting, and the door lowered with cathedral slowness, and the smell of old ozone came out like a weather front. And he took one step back, not in fear but in respect, because there are thresholds one crosses slowly, even when you are yourself the key. Inside lay no cockpit or hold or bay as he knew them, but a narrow chamber lined in that same beetle plate skin, the walls flexing microscopically as if breathing, though he suspected the motion was a trick of the eye. And the floor was not a floor but a membrane that held his weight firmly, while still giving the sense that a lake extended below the skin. Beyond the entry was another seam, this one vertical, and embossed beside it a glyph he recognized only because he had memorized too many old manuals in dark rooms. A symbol meaning map, but not a star map as navigators draw them in glittering webs. Rather the older meaning territory itself, boundary and blood, the totality of where a thing extends, and the red pencil line in the hangar's warning rose in his memory. Unless you are very sure you are meant to. He placed his palm to the vertical seam without drumming this time, and a line of warmth traced his lifeline as if being read, and the membrane under his boots vibrated with a frequency so low it felt like a direction rather than a sound, pointing inward. and the seam unzipped into blinding luminosity that did not hurt his eyes because it did not exist for eyes. It existed for something behind the eyes. And without ever moving from the threshold, he stood in a room the size of a thought where a model of the desert rose ghostly in the air with the hangar rendered as a whole cut out of a single sheet. And that sheet was the town, and the road, and the shore, and the shallow sea beyond. And above them hung not stars but vectors like spears thrown down, each line a trajectory traced in the past towards some point above the horizon where they converged in a knot of math. And the knot turned and opened like a flower. And inside the flower was a sphere that was not a sphere but a wound in the world, the precise diameter of a promise. And the promise was written in mathematics too elegant to be human and too compassionate to be anything else. And he understood with a cold clarity that made him smile despite the shiver in his hands that this machine did not travel through space so much as it asked space to remember a time when here and there were closer together. And then it persuaded the world to tell that story again. Whatever this engine was, it did not burn propellant, it burned certainty. It consumed maps until only intentions remained. And that is why the seal of the Strategic Relic program had branded it and hidden it and written prayers on the wall, because such a device could end wars by refusing to believe in the distances wars require. He whispered, "Are you hungry?" And the low frequency shifted in a way that could have been a scent. And he knew then what he would have to become to wake it fully. Not merely an owner or a pilot, but a sacrament. Someone capable of choosing where to be with sufficient honesty that the universe would blush and move aside. Chapter 3. The pilots who refused to touch it. Word travels in towns the way heat travels through metal, and the hangar's lamps humming after midnight did not go unnoticed, nor did the rumor that the municipal clerk had finally rid himself of that cursed door by selling it for coins smaller than a memory. And by the third sunrise old pilots began to circle. Drawn not by greed, they had retired greed when fuel went scarce, but by the old muscle memory of having something to be wary of. They gathered at the hangar's threshold in the guise of accidental passers-by, men and women whose hairlines had retreated in the face of too many suns, whose hands curled, as if perpetually seeking the ghost of a throttle. And when Aaron came out to fetch another coil of cable, they gave him nods that counted as greeting and warning both. "You going to fly it?" a woman with 3 rings in her brow asked, her voice more smoke than sound, the sort of voice that eats its consonants the way an engine eats vibration. And he said, "If it lets me," which earned him a few small grins because that was the right answer. Another pilot, tall, with a sleepy blink that suggested he had seen enough things to remain unimpressed by any one thing, leaned on the door frame and said, "We heard about that one. In the way people talk about a cliff, not as a rumor, but as a hazard." They told him the story in pieces, as if to reassemble it fully would be to conjure the old danger by name. And the pieces were that a unit out of the southern expanse recovered a craft too quiet for sensors to remember, a machine that slid through a blockade as if it had no mass. And when they tried to reverse engineer it, the universe around their lab folded like damp cloth and refused to be ironed. And the surviving engineers learned to say that some devices are not weapons, but statements. And statements cannot be managed by being reset. They can only be contradicted, which is why the agency with too many long names on its letterhead turned the machine off and hid it in a place with low gossip pressure and called it an asset while meaning burden. And now here it lay like a sleeping verdict waiting for a defendant who didn't exist yet. And the woman with the ring said softly, "They told us to never touch it because it teaches you to be honest in a way that hurts. And pilots aren't built for that. We require a certain density of lies to turn at speed." Aaron listened with his back against the cool metal of the door, trying to hold their words and the machine's silence in the same mental cup, without spilling either. And when they had finished, he said, "I could leave it to its dust. I could sell the metal by weight and buy 10 houses. I could ignore the door and turn this into a storage unit for bolts. And each of those choices would be easier than the one I seem to be making." And the sleepy-eyed man smiled as if at a good line in a bad play and said, "The thing about choices is that they are largely vetoes we cast against the 100 people we might otherwise become, and it sounds like you have committed to vetoing the versions of you that value ease, which makes the rest of us nervous, because nerve is contagious." They did not step inside. They refused to cross the door lip, and he did not invite them, because something sacred had swollen in the hangar like a swelling tide, and it would be unkind to pretend otherwise. Instead, he asked what they feared most about such a ship, and the ringed woman said, "Not that it will kill us. Machines can always kill us. Not that it will be stolen. Things can always be stolen. Not even that it will make us obsolete. Because obsolescence is just another word for rest. What we fear is that it will ask us to decide where to be with no excuse for error, that it will remove the mercy of drift, that it will leave us alone with our choices and accelerate them until they are irreversible. And pilots live by reversible mistakes because we are always one correction away from surviving." He wanted to say that life already flowed like that, irreversibly and without correction, but he did not say it because the hangar vibrated again at the low frequency that meant "I am listening." And he did not wish to use the ship as a wedge against the people he would still need to drink with at the dockside when this was over. Instead, he asked if any of them would stand by the main breaker while he performed a test and pull it if the lights went strange. And after a long silence, the tall man nodded and said, "I can be your coward, the best kind, the kind that admits it loudly." They set the scene like priests arranging instruments, cables as careful as sutures, couplers aligned as if for dentistry, a ladder under the catwalk where the main breaker stood like a hilt in a stone, and Aaron took his place by the vertical seam inside the nose door with his palm hovering like a blessing withheld, and the pilots arranged themselves along the threshold, none willing to place even one boot over the line, and the woman with the rings muttered a litany of old ship names under her breath as if to remind herself that she had loved many and buried few. He breathed. He thought of the map that was not a map. He thought of the engine's mathematics that made distances blush. He thought of his mother's blender and of sesame clogging gears. He thought of the municipal clerk's apology wink. And then he asked himself aloud, "Where do you want to be if there were no stars to triangulate you?" And the answer that rose was not a coordinate or a landmark, but a person, his sister Lien, who had left 5 years ago with a caravan that meant to cross the salt, pan to a research station and never sent a final ping, and whose absence had become the root his life grew around, as if grief were soil. The engine heard that. He felt it in the skin of his palm as the seam warmed and the low tone dragged itself up a register into something like a held note, and the hangar lights bucked as if some large animal had rolled beneath the floor, and the pilots cursed in the affectionate tone of professionals cursing at physics, and the tall man's hand hovered over the breaker without touching it, because he was a coward only in title, and the air distorted between Aaron and the ship so gently you might have mistaken it for heat rippling after a furnace door is opened, and then the chamber bloomed with that not light that feeds the brain rather than the eye, and the model of the world rose again. But this time the desert was a skin draped over keys and organs, and the trajectory vectors above like spears did not converge on a flower but on a face, his sister's face, not rendered in detail but in the geometry of her laugh and the slope of her listening, and the machine showed him not where she was but what it would mean to go toward her, and the meaning was a long river of decisions and a short needle of risk and a loop of people he would gather to survive the middle, and the machine asked, wordlessly but clearly, "Are you the kind of man who will ask others to risk being accelerated into their own honesty?" And he whispered, "Yes," because he was, and the hangar floor did its low tremor again and then grew still, and the breaker lights calmed, and the tall man blew out a breath in a baritone fog, and the ringed woman used 2 fingers to wipe at tears as if they were grease. No pilot dared to touch it, the rumor had said, and the rumor remained true. But the corollary that formed that afternoon was that no pilot could stand near it and remain entirely indifferent, which is how Aaron found himself, before dusk, with 5 volunteers to do jobs they swore they did not want. The tall man to handle power discipline and kill the breaker if the lights began to lie. The ringed woman to monitor environmental baselines so they would know when the engine's suggestion to the world became more than suggestion. A younger mechanic named Pash to read microfractures on the cradle and ensure the hull's restlessness did not tear its own bed apart. An old priest of the machine diaspora, who claimed he hated machines but loved the truth to sit by the nose and ask questions no one else dared to phrase. And a cook named Jana who brought rice and tan stew, and said she would stir until the pot taught her where to point her ladle. He wanted to protest that he had not asked for followers, that this was a private madness. But leadership sometimes arrives disguised as the people who refuse to let you be alone with your courage, and he found that he did not mind the disguise. They worked through the night. making the hangar into a monastery of practical devotions. Tables positioned at right angles to lines of power, not for aesthetic reasons, but because the priest said right angles cut lies, and chalk marks along the floor that Jana insisted on painting over with old varnish so dust could not steal their measures. And in that web of caution the engine began to hum back, not aggressively, not possessively, but as if enjoying the company of people who talked to it like weather rather than like a beast to be saddled. At dawn, when the shadows were long enough to braid with their reflections, Aaron placed both palms to the seam and said, "Take me where my sister would be if the world forgave its own mistakes." And the chamber opened, and the model reoriented. And this time vectors did not converge. They diverged, peeling away from each other like chords resolving to different keys. And the priest whispered, "You asked the wrong question. Not where she is, but where you must become to find her." And Aaron felt the engine's almost laughter spread through the floor like the memory of wakefulness after a nap that lasted years. Chapter 4. The day the distance moved. They did not lift the machine from its cradle. They let it lift itself by instructing the world to hold it differently. And that sentence was a heresy in every manual, but true in the hangar. Because when they finally synchronized the couplers, and the breaker, and the solar blush, and the hydrogen pulse into a single sustained breath, the hull did not rumble or shake or shout. It sighed, and the cradle sighed with it. And then the cradle's bolts grew bored with the concept of gravity, and unthreaded gently, falling to the varnished chalk lines with the careful grace of utensils set beside a plate. The pilots did not flee. They stood with their hands on the door frame like believers gripping a tomb's edge, and Jana set her ladle down, as if setting down an oar. And the priest kept his eyes open past the point where most eyes close, and the engine's chamber unfolded its knot light again, and this time invited them all in, which none accepted except Aaron, who stepped onto the membrane, and felt it accept him at a depth that made his knees want to bend in gratitude. He did not sit in a chair because there were no chairs. He did not strap into a harness because there were no harnesses. He did not flip a switch because there were no switches. He chose, and the choice was not an act but a stance. And in that stance he lifted his chin a fraction and thought of the last place he had seen his sister in the world where maps were still convincing. A road where the salt began to glimmer like scales on a serpent that had swallowed a sun, and the machine took that thought and laid it against the geometry of forgiveness it had shown him, and found a line of mercy through terrain and time, and then expanded that line until it was a corridor wide enough for a craft to walk without brushing the walls. And then it asked him, "Are you ready to be where you most wish to be instead of where you can survive to be?" And he said yes without thinking, and then thought of his yes and accepted it. And the hangar did not fall away so much as it slid aside into a pocket of air that would be there for it when it returned. And the floor's low note rose until even the ringed woman winced, and then it stopped, and there was only the whisper of their own blood in their ears, and the smell of cinnamon. And when they realized they were in motion, it was not because anything outside had changed outside. Through the open door, the desert still lay like a sleeping animal, but because inside the chamber the model recalibrated, and the vectors swung like compass needles in the wake of a magnet, and the wound sphere within the flower rotated and revealed a new facet where the mathematics simplified into a kindness a child could memorize. And Aaron laughed, and the machine matched his laugh with a better one. And somewhere in the deep interior a mechanism yearned to stretch limbs it did not have, because this was not a machine designed to travel, it was a machine designed to forgive distance for existing. They crossed 30 kilometers, which felt like one breath held fractionally longer than comfort, and then released. And when the breath released, they were no longer beside the hangar door. They were above the salt pan, a meter off the ground, though the membrane still kissed Aaron's boots like a floor, a ghost field holding them like a held bird. And the pilots swore in wonder and fear because the hangar's door had become a window, and the window showed a landscape blistered white and stitched with old survey flags. And at the horizon a long, low building lay like a sentence left unfinished, and Jana whispered a name. The research station where the caravans used to stop to trade data, and Aaron tasted tears he did not remember instructing his eyes to make. And the engine made its low note again, this time like the sound of someone placing their palm on your back and saying there, "One more step." And he let his weight shift, and the craft drifted toward the long building with the unhurried glide of a thought that has finally earned its end. They did not so much arrive as admit that they had always intended to be there. And the long building paneled in sunburned composites lifted its head, if a building can lift its head, and turned the blank arcs of its camera housings toward them with the dim instinct of a thing that had been alone too long. And Aaron placed his palm to the seam and said, "Announce me like rain." And the engine pulsed, and the building's locks coughed and opened. And inside the station smelled like old paper and burned plastic, and under those bass notes a sharpness like iodine. And in the first room they found coats still hung on pegs and mugs that had surrendered their last water to the air. And in the second room a map of the pan with red dots that moved if you looked away, except there was no power for moving red dots, which meant the dots moved in memory only. And in the third room a door their pry bars could not persuade. And the tall man stepped back and said, "The breaker can cut power, but it cannot cut secrets." And the priest muttered something about locks that recognized confessions, and Aaron, who had learned to place hands before he placed tools, laid his fingers on the door and said, "I am here for the person I failed by letting her leave without me." And the door sighed so gently you might have called it a crack settling, and it opened inward on a corridor that went down. They descended into air that remembered breath and into rooms that had become museums without curators. And there in the fifth room, on a cot beside a bank of instruments that had learned the economy of blinking only when necessary, lay Lien, thinner than the lath geometry from the engine's model, but unmistakable in the angle of her rest. And when she opened her eyes, she did not cry out or ask how many years had passed, because she did not wear time like a cloak. She wore it like a necklace, with one bead missing. And she smiled at Aaron and said, "You took your time arranging your apology." And he laughed and sobbed and ruined the dignity of the moment, and she allowed it. And when he could speak, he asked what had happened, and she told him in long, patient sentences that she had stayed when the caravan moved on because the station's core asked her to, not in words but in the urgency of a child with a fever, because they had discovered something under the salt, something that hummed in a way that may have taught the engine its mathematics or learned from them, or perhaps both. And when the storms came and the caravan stopped and the station's people began to dwindle, she had learned to sleep deeper and deeper between maintenance cycles, trusting the core to wake her when it felt an honest knock on the door. And today, she said, it felt a knock with your hand bones in it. They stood there and let the universe rearrange their maps quietly because the loud part was over. And when the pilots trickled down the corridor, they halted shyly at the door, because reunion is a ritual, and even old flyers know when to hold their breath. And Jana went back upstairs to put rice on, because joy is metabolized best with food. They did not take Lien away immediately, because she insisted on introducing them to the station core, which turned out to be less a machine than a conversation whose hardware had been reluctantly retained for the sake of creatures who required something to point at. And the core greeted the engine through Aaron's palm in a flurry of gentle harmonics, like two musicians tuning to the same pitch. And in that tuning Aaron understood that the relic in his hangar and the archaic intelligence beneath. The salt had once been portals to a way of traveling that the dissolution wars had broken not out of malice but out of panic, and the strategic relic program had hidden one and buried the other and written down their fear as policy and called it safety. And for a long time the world had obeyed. Now, in a tired port town where the landing grids flickered like old film, and in a salt station where a woman had slept like a tide, the world was deciding to disobey gently, with rice and cables and the careful hands of people who asked permission before touching. They stayed 3 days mapping the station's needs and repairing the worst of the leaks and teaching the engine to drink from the core's memory of rain so they could power lights without bullying the breaker. And every evening the ringed woman sat on the threshold staring at the engine's hull with a look that had lost its fear and found envy's kinder cousin, admiration. On the morning of the fourth day Aaron said, "We go home," because home had become not the hangar but the place where machines. Gentleness could be taught to people, and Lien agreed on the condition that they return in cycles to keep the station from becoming lonely again, and the engine made its low note like a scent. And they rose the way bubbles rise when a hand relaxes around them. Ending, the hangar that taught the world to move. When they slid back into the hangar's measure, the municipal clerk was waiting with two officers whose faces wore the expression of men tasked with enforcing a policy they did not write. And there was a moment when Aaron thought the story would become small again, trapped in the amber of permits and seizures, until the priest stepped forward and said in a voice that had officiated at more funerals than weddings, "You cannot confiscate a way of being." And the tall man added, "You can pull the breaker, but we learned how to sing." And Jana offered rice, and the ringed woman, who had avoided touching the hull for days out of superstition and respect in equal measure, laid 2 fingers on it now and said, "Be polite." And the engine purred, and the officers discovered that their orders had not prepared them for being soothed by a machine, and the clerk cleared his throat and said, "The town council would like to renegotiate the sale." And Aaron, remembering the 60 cents and the apology, wink, said, "Of course, but the renegotiation will not be about price. It will be about what we do together." And in those words, a map of the town redrew itself silently, routes of people and power shifting toward the hangar like rivers adjusting to a new moon. They made the hangar into a school with the engine as its patient center, not to teach pilots to fly too quietly for sensors or to slip blockades without leaving wakes, though those who needed to learn such things found ways to be taught, but to teach children and cooks and clerks and the sort of elderly who delight in new riddles how to ask where they wish to be in a manner that shortened the distance between wishing and being without erasing the responsibility of the wish. They built rituals that looked like maintenance because people trust rituals that involve wrenches, and they wrote manuals that read like prayers because people respect things that can be said at night when fear widens the room. And they told officials from bigger towns who came to assess the risk that the risk was real and the mitigation was honesty. And when the officials frowned and asked to see the safety cases, Jana handed them bowls and said, "Eat first, because the first safety case is whether we can stand here together without hating each other's hunger." The engine laughed often and softly, and one afternoon the ringed woman finally stepped fully across the threshold and placed both palms on the seam and said, "Where do I belong if I am not afraid?" And the machine answered her by lifting the floor a fraction, so she felt the town's breath under her heels. And she cried the way people cry when their knees discover they have been locked for years without permission. And the other old pilots looked away, and then not away because envy is only bad when it hardens. Aaron and Lien took the engine out on small trips at first, not to conquer space, but to conjugate it here, nearest, and they brought back from the salt station crates of records and instruments that played sounds the town had not heard since the freight lines were rerouted. And they learned the names of the people who had slept their last sleep there and carved those names into a beam in the hangar where the light from the door gleam kissed their letters at dusk. In time, caravans returned, curious to see the school where distance blushed, and with them came travelers who had become tired of maps that lie. And among them were children who asked the best questions in voices that did not make apologies. Can it take me to the place where my father might have forgiven himself? Can it show me what my city would look like if it remembered the river? Can it make 2 people less far apart if they are both stubborn? And the teachers answered carefully because the engine answered carefully, which was the point. On a day of hard blue sky and generous wind, Aaron walked a loop of the town with Lien and the priest and Jana and the tall breaker man and the ringed woman, and they found themselves at the municipal office where the clerk stood with another set of forms, this time the kind that renamed things with ceremony. And with a grin less apologetic and more proud, he asked what they would call the hangar now that it had become not a storage unit for bolts, but a place where the world met its own better arguments. And Aaron looked at the engine, and the engine looked back, and then at the town, and then at him again. And he said, "Call it the door with no memory, because every time we cross it we do not repeat, but choose." And the clerk nodded as if he had known that all along. Years later, when distant governments came to ask whether such machines should be licensed or destroyed or licensed in a manner indistinguishable from destroyed, the hangar school did not barricade itself or appeal to an old seal with too many long names. It invited the officials in to stand on the membrane and to feel their own breath change when they said where they wished to be instead of where they had been placed. And some of those officials left smiling against their will, and some left angry at their own smiles, and some did not leave for several days because they were busy renegotiating themselves. The town grew, not large but dense with meaning, and the port's landing grids glowed more often because it turns out that places where people decide together where to be become destinations on their own. And out on the salt pan the station learned the comfort of visits, and its core told jokes no one had programmed. And under the floor of the hangar, the varnished chalk lines collected scuffs and ring stains and children's drawings and the scrawl of a priest who had learned to love machines. Because they tell truths slowly enough for the human heart. No pilot dared to touch it. The saying had gone, and it remained partially true. If by touching you meant the old way with hands eager to extract advantage. But many people learned to touch it in the new way, with questions shaped like courage and palms that asked permission. And Aaron Kill, who bought a door for 60 cents and found a statement behind it, learned that the most dangerous technology is not an engine that eats maps, but a community that agrees to become a verb. And if you want a final image to hold, take this. Late evening in a town that once pretended to be dying, the hangar door a rectangle of honey light in the blue, the engine's hull drinking that light and returning it as a modest sheen. Lien sitting on the step with a mug and a child asking whether the machine remembers names, and Aaron answering, "It does when we do," and the child nodding as if this were obvious. Because to those born after the day the distance moved, it is.